Good evening, everybody. We are here this evening to remember the 10 men whose names appear on the World War I memorial plaque in the adjoining church hall, which reads, "In honoured and loving memory of the men from this Sunday school and church who fell in the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Their name liveth for evermore." We thank you all for joining us as we discover what it was like to live during this period of history and hear a little about the men who made the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf. There has been a slight change to the programme this evening. Sadly, Doug Howlett, our Society Chairman, cannot be with us this evening, nor can Christine Howells. However, I'm pleased to say that Jeannie Smith and Rachel Phillips have stepped in at the last moment, so I thank them for that. The programme of music has been coordinated by Richard Hart, and performers are Richard, Anne Mills, David Hart, Chris Hart, the St Mary's Singers and the Methodist Worship Band from the Methodist Church. We are very grateful to all the performers and also to all our leaders this evening. We'd like to invite you to join us for refreshments afterwards. These will be served in the adjoining hall where the memorial plaque is sited. Before we begin, I would respectfully ask that you do not applaud during the performances. There will be an opportunity to show your appreciation at the end of the evening. I would now like to invite the minister from this church, the Reverend Peter Goodhall, to begin our evening of remembrance.
On behalf of the Methodist congregation here, may I warmly welcome you here this evening. Myself and my wife Jo, who will be playing the guitar, have only been in Haverhill since February, so I'm sure we're going to learn a lot about Haverhill, past and present, and we hope that you will also learn something new tonight as well. And I'm grateful to all those who have helped to prepare and those who will participate in our programme this evening. Tonight, may we be aware of that great cloud of witnesses who surround us as we meet, those that we remember. We begin by listening to the story of this church and its witness. The story of this church and the rise of primitive Methodism in this town begins long before the Great War. On the 6th of January 1762, while visiting a friend in Stoke-by-Clare, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, came to Haverhill, stopping to preach in a barn and then in a house. At 5 o'clock in the morning the next day, he preached again, before going on his way through Steeple Bumpstead. Despite the large congregations that gathered to hear him, there was no lasting result of Methodism in the town or in the area for nearly 100 years. It was in 1857 that Thomas Cole, a native of Haverhill, was converted in Western Colville. He became a local preacher who preached at a camp meeting on a piece of waste land that he declared would become the site of a church. However, it was to be 12 years before that piece of wasteland was finally purchased. It is clear that the church building we are seated in this evening was not here at the time of the Great War. It was not in fact conceived until the late 1960s. The first meeting house for those who listened to Thomas Cole was an old bakehouse in Withersfield Road, which was rented for 1 shilling a week. The congregation moved briefly to a building in Lay's Yard in the High Street, but returned to the bakehouse before fitting out the Temperance Hall in Chantry Road as a chapel. In 1867, the first £5 for a church fund was collected by a man named Charles Rash. 2 years later, on the 20th of May 1869, the Reverend Horrocks purchased a piece of waste ground for the sum of £120. A local builder subsequently bought a piece of the land for £85. So the actual plot for the new chapel was just £35. In 1874, building operations began, with a stone laying ceremony taking place on Good Friday, the 24th of April. The chapel was opened for worship on the 27th of December the same year, at a cost of just over £600. Within 4 years, the building was too small. So a gallery was built at a further cost of £38. Just before the turn of the century, in 1897, the chapel was altered and enlarged, and vestries were added at a cost of £350. In all, the chapel cost just over £1,000, and as the money was raised mainly by halfpenny and penny weekly collections, it was not until the 24th of January 1912 that the church was finally cleared of debt. The chapel served the Methodist congregation until 1969, when it was demolished to make way for the church that we are in this evening. So, the men named on the war memorial would not have been familiar with this building, but they would have worshipped in the chapel that was built on this site. And tonight, we will remember them.
In 1908, Haverhill was a market town and head of a county court district. The market was held on Fridays, and periodical sales of cattle and sheep conducted by Mr. Charles Borden. There were brickworks, the earth being of excellent quality for bricks. There were successful builders, surgeons, brewers, millers, many publicans, and even a town crier, Albert Dare, of the White Horse in the High Street. The principal manufactory was that of Messrs. D. Gertine and Sons at Chauntry Mill, where upwards of 3,000 people were employed. As a town, Haverhill had benefited from the generosity of its Victorian businessmen. The town hall had been presented to the town in 1883 by Daniel Gertine at a cost of £5,000. On the ground floor, it contained a reading room, committee rooms, a large lecture room, a chess and billiard room, and had offices at the rear. On the first floor was a large and lofty hall with a gallery and orchestra. There was also a fine organ that had been presented by Daniel Gertine Jr. and his wife. There was company housing and a board school which offered a sound education for both boys and girls. In 1900, the recreation ground, a gift to the town from W.B. Gertine to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, was opened with great ceremony. The Gertine family also erected a cricket pavilion for the town. Haverhill had a station on the branch of the Great Eastern Railway from Cambridge to Sudbury and to Bury St Edmunds, and was also a junction of the Cone Valley Railway line to Chapel and Marks Tay. There was even an open-air swimming pool, the property of the local surgeon, A.J. Simpson, that was constructed in 1903.
The town also had its own local newspaper, several churches and an active Sunday school union. By all accounts, it was a progressive town. The women were certainly quite a militant bunch, for at the end of February 1905, a number of those making khaki uniforms at Chauncey Mills walked out for a week to get an extra 6p per dozen garments. Then, in 1912, Haverhill women held a suffragette meeting on the Market Hill to support the call for votes for women. This cause was obviously less popular with the men of the town, as after half an hour, an element of local rowdy youth broke up the meeting. The town was centred around Queen Street and the High Street, stretched from Withersfield Road to Hamlet Road, and from Ratton Road to Burton End. It was lit with gas from works erected in 1854. Many of this chapel's congregation lived within walking distance: Burton End, Vine Cottage, Primrose Hill, Chauncey Road, St Botolph's, Crowland Road, Mill Road, Withersfield Road and the Downs. It was a close community where neighbours, who were often extended family members, knew each other, worked together and also worshipped together. If we look at this map of Haverhill 1900, you can see where the 10 casualties grew up and lived, just a stone throws away. Of the 10 men we are remembering this evening, half of them lived at some time or another in Vine Cottages, a row of terraced cottages that began at the junction of Camps Road and Crowland Road, virtually next door to this church.
In 1914, life as everyone knew it was set to change, and not for the better. On the 28th of June, a shot rang out in Sarajevo that ended over 40 years of peace in Europe. In little more than a month after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the First World War had begun. On the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France. And on the 4th of August, Germany declared war on Belgium. In response, the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, gave Germany an ultimatum to stand down. When they failed to do so, conflict was inevitable. And from 11 p.m. on August the 4th, 1914, Great Britain was at war with Germany. On the 7th of August, the first members of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, landed in France. The BEF was made up of regular soldiers. They, along with the French army, were able to slow and initially stop the German advance. The cost was great, though, and the British Expeditionary Force needed reinforcements. On the 11th of August, the "Your King and Country Need You" slogan was published, calling for 100,000 men to enlist for Kitchener's new army. This target was met within 2 weeks. After Haverhill's territorial battalion left the town in August 1914, the local recruiting officer, Mr. E. Butler, at the Red Lion in the High Street, enlisted 128 men within days. For more than 4 years, war raged on land, sea and in the air, across the globe. Millions of military personnel were mobilised. The new technology of tanks and aircraft played a crucial role, and the human cost was devastating as the war laid waste to a whole generation of young men.
The Territorials by H. Mason of Haverhill. This was probably or possibly written by Percy H. Mason, who was born in 1860 and lived in Stour House in Station Road. He was the manager in a clothing factory, most likely Chauncey Mill. True to the call of duty, they leave their hearths and homes for England, home and beauty, to battle all that comes. Now see them marching gaily to the sound of comrades' feet. Though dangers meet them daily, they think not of retreat. Their thoughts are all of England, land of the truly free, not the German fatherland across the Northern Sea. Deeper than the Northern Sea is their deep love of home. They fear no son of Germany, wherever he may roam. It's English blood that fills their veins and gives them strength to fight, not the greed of wide domains, but honour, justice, right. And now, Anne Mills is going to sing We Do Not Sing of Heroes, the words by Chris Green in 2014, and the music specially written for this occasion by Richard Hart. Great-grandparents, William and Charlotte, living in the Crowland area of Haverhill in 1841. John Clayton came from a family that had lived in the town for quite a few generations. John was the third of 7 children. His parents were John and Charlotte Clayton, and he was born in September 1895 at 3 Pease Hill, where the market square is today. Shortly after this, the family moved to Chantry Road. In 1911, a family of members of working age were employed in Chantry Mills.
John, aged 15, was working as a walk winder. His father was a hair weaver. His mother was a coat finisher. And his brother William Isaacs and sister Gladys also worked in the factory. On the 16th of November 1914, John joined the territorial force of the 5th Southwarks. He was, however, the 2nd Battalion, Princess Charlotte of Wales's Royal Berkshire Regiment, with whom he saw action in France. During April 1915, the 2nd Battalion began tours in trenches, with short periods as divisional reserve. On the 8th of May, they moved into assembly trenches, ready for the attack on Ober's Ridge. They went over the top early in the morning of the 9th and were cut down by German machine gun fire. The survivors were pinned down in no man's land, and there was no significant progress. Early the next morning, Field Marshal Haig called off the offensive. The British had suffered 11,000 casualties in one day of fighting. On the 9th of May, John's battalion war diary recorded that 5 officers were killed, 9 were wounded, and 6 were missing. 39 other ranks were killed. 198 were wounded and 36 missing. John was one of the 36 other ranks who were listed as missing. John's parents, who were now living in Vine Cottages, received a letter from the British Red Cross and Order of St. John some 4 months later, on the 7th September 1915. It read, "We deeply regret to have to inform you that according to a German list of the 21st of August 1915, received by us through Geneva on the 7th of September 1915, Private J. Claydon, Berkshire Regiment, was found dead on the 3rd of August in a trench by a German patrol. These were the only details we have at present. Please accept our sincerest sympathy." 2 weeks later, the South West Suffolk Echo announced that John's parents had received official news of John's death from the War Office, confirming that John was most likely killed during the action on the 9th of May, some 3 months before the Germans found him. Private John Clayton was 19 years old. Unfortunately, the Germans did not say whether they had buried John. If they had buried him, his grave was never identified, and as a result, he is commemorated in the Plugestart Memorial, along with many others who have no known grave. John is also remembered on the Roll of Honour for employees of D. Gertine and Sons Limited at Chauncey Mills. Jeannie will now tell you more about the Clayton family.
John Clayton's cousins, William Charles and Albert, both also died in the war. William Charles died exactly 2 weeks after John, and Albert was to die on the 10th of November 1918, the penultimate day of the war. John's brother, William Isaacs Clayton, spent November 1914 in France, but was sent home with frostbite at the beginning of December. He returned to France in March 1916, barely 6 months after the family became aware of his brother's death, and was in the field with the 13th London Regiment during the early days of the Battle of the Somme. William wrote a letter to his mother, which gives an indication about how an incident affected him. and this was reported in the local newspaper. He wrote, "I think I must consider myself very lucky to be alive after what I went through last Friday morning, and I shall never forget it. It was the second morning after we came out, and we had just finished breakfast when they started bombarding the village we were billeted in. Of course, we all had orders to run to the nearest trenches when a shell burst 5 yards from me, and I was blown up and remembered nothing for 3 days. How I escaped any injuries, I do not know, but thank God I was safe. I do not want another experience like it. My nerves are all gone, but do not let this worry you, because I am going along fine now. Do not write to me until I know for certain where I am going. I might have the luck to get to England." His army medical record shows that he was suffering from shell shock, and on the 21st of July 1916, and was returned home late in August 1916. In September 1918, he was transferred to the Labour Corps, the agricultural company, and treatment for epilepsy was recommended. Whether this condition was directly associated with his shell shock is not known.
William Isaacs Claydon was not the only soldier to suffer shell shock. Thousands of other soldiers returned from battlefields and trenches of the First World War, reeling from the sheer horror of the conflict. By the end of the war, 20,000 men were still suffering from shell shock. Thousands more had experienced its symptoms during their military service. Doctors were mystified by this condition that they hadn't seen before. Soldiers were returning from the trenches blind, deaf, mute or paralysed. Early symptoms included tiredness, irritability, giddiness, lack of concentration and headaches. The men suffered mental breakdowns, making it impossible for them to remain in the front line, but doctors couldn't find any physical damage to explain the symptoms. The term shell shock was coined in 1917 by a medical officer called Charles Myers. Some doctors argued that the only cure for shell shock was a complete rest away from the fighting. If you were an officer, you were likely to be sent home to recuperate. The army was less sympathetic to ordinary soldiers with shell shock, and some senior officers took the view that these men were cowards who were trying to get out of fighting. Philip Gibbs, a journalist on the Western Front, recalled, "The shell shock cases were the worst to see and the worst to cure. At first, shell shock was regarded as nonsense and sheer cowardice by generals who had not themselves witnessed its effects. They had not seen, as I did, strongly sturdy men shaking with ague, mouthing like madmen, figures of dreadful terror, speechless and uncontrollable. It was a physical as well as a moral shock which had reduced them to this quivering state." Between 1914 and 1918, the British Army identified 80,000 men, 2% of those who saw active service, as suffering from shell shock. A much larger number of soldiers with these symptoms were classified as malingerers and sent back to the front line. In some cases, men committed suicide. Others broke down under the pressure and refused to obey the orders of their officers. Some responded to the pressures of shell shock by deserting. Sometimes soldiers who disobeyed orders got shot on the spot. In some cases, they were court-martialed. A common punishment for disobeying orders was field punishment number 1. This involved the offender being attached to a fixed object for up to 2 hours a day and for a period of up to 3 months. These men were often put in a place within range of enemy shell fire. The Shot at Dawn Memorial in the National Arboretum commemorates 307 British and Commonwealth soldiers who were shot for desertion or cowardice during World War I. Most were sentenced after a short trial in which no real opportunity for defence was allowed. Today it's recognised that many of them were underage and suffering from shell shock. The Methodist worship band will now perform Be Still My Soul.
There were not many weeks where bad news was not received by a family in the town. However, it would be another 15 months before the congregation of this church would mourn another of its members. And this man was my uncle. William Pembroke Mills was born early in 1897 to Robert Pembroke Mills and Sarah Nee Buttle, who had married in Haverhill in the winter of 1894 and were living at 30 Withersfield Road in 1901. William's brother Arthur, my father, was born in 1900 and the family was complete. Richard, known as Pem, was a tailor and had moved from his birthplace of Halesworth to work and live in Haverhill some 5 years before his marriage. Sadly, he died at the early age of 36 years when his sons were just 8 and 5 years old. By 1911, William was now known to family and friends as Pen, like his father. And now, aged 14, he was working as an errand boy. His mother, Sarah, was working as a cloth and cord machinist, and they all lived at 1 Eden Place, Haverhill. The family were members of this church, and Pam attended the Sunday school here. In late 1915, Pam enlisted at Barking, Essex, joining the 2nd Battalion, the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He found himself involved in the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916. By the 14th of August, they were in Mametz Wood, the battlefield of the First Battle of the Somme. Gives a count of around 44 woods and 15 copses. The largest was Mametz Wood at 186 acres, and known to the British Expeditionary Force as the Queen of the Woods. It was said to be a tasteful collection of limes, oaks, hornbeams, hazel, and the occasional beech, with brambles and saplings taking over much of the ground cover, due to the lack of maintenance in the woods since the war began in 1914. The war diary for the 17th of August tells us that the battalion remained in Mametz Wood, furnishing working parties. 7 other ranks from the battalion were killed on this day. William Pembroke Mills was one of them. Pem's mother and brother were still living at 1 Eden Place when they received the tragic news that he had died on the 17th of August 1916, aged just 19 years. Rifleman Mills is remembered on the Theatre Memorial to the missing of the Somme. The Haverhill District Sunday School Union provided a bronze tablet which read, "In memory of Pen Mills, killed in action in France, August 17th, 1916. Sadly, this plaque and the others awarded to the members of the Methodist Sunday School seem to have been lost. On the day of the dedication of the Haverhill War Memorial, a wreath was sent bearing the inscription, "In loving memory of dear Pen, killed in action August 17th, 1916, Mother and Arthur."
Sizer is a long-established Haverhill name. This is a photo of Clifford George Sizer, born in 1897, the youngest of the 3 children born to Joseph Sizer and his wife Emily Free. The family lived at 8 Vine Cottages, Burton End, but when Clifford was 5 years old, his father died, leaving his mother Emily to work as a laundry woman and take in a lodger to support a young family. Clifford's brother Herbert found employment as a miller. His sister Edith worked as a sewing machinist, and Clifford himself was employed firstly as a grocer's errand boy, then a milkman and a warehouseman for the Haverhill Cooperative Society. In 1912, Clifford's mother married Albert Reeder. Clifford joined the 13th Battalion Essex Regiment as a private. The West Ham Pals was the nickname given to the battalion as it was recruited at the start of World War I from West Ham area, with the majority of recruits being supporters of West Ham. In early February 1917, some 4 months after arriving in France, the battalion were billeted in Hut at Villiers. The war diaries for this period tell us that on the 18th they moved to a sector near Courcelette, The men were kept busy deepening and strengthening posts and constructing the splinter-proof shelters before being relieved at about midnight on the 21st, while B Company went to dugouts at Courtiette and C Company went to wolf huts. A and D companies were unable to return from the front line due to daylight breaking, so it was the following day before they got back to their dugouts. The battalion was relieved the following day. This was a day too late for Clifford, who was one of the 7 other ranks from A and D companies who were killed in action on the 22nd of February 1917. Like the 2 previous casualties we have heard about, Clifford was 19 years of age. With no known grave, he is remembered on the Fiat Memorial. The family roof at the unveiling of Haverhill War Memorial in 1920 was inscribed, "In loving memory of Cliff Sizer, for mother, stepfather, sister and brother." Babs will now tell us how Haverhill supported its men at the front.
The people left behind in Haverhill all did their bit to help the war effort, especially supporting the men from the town. Special efforts became the norm. One Friday was set aside in the town and surrounding villages to raise money. This was called Our Day. Our Day was organised by the Red Cross and Order of St John to raise funds for wounded soldiers, for war widows, POWs and various other causes. Small flags were sold. Very few did not wear one of these. Some even sported 2 or 3 to show how many donations they had made. Over the years, the Red Cross and Order of St John arranged many fundraising efforts. At Mr Boardman's weekly sale on market day, Mrs Brown from Greenwich entered 3 geese in the sale and gave the proceeds from their sale to the Our Day cause. They were sold over and over again. And at the last count, £4, 4 shillings and 6pence was added to the fund. At another sale, Mr F Pitts of West Ratting donated a pig which raised £139 for Red Cross funds. The manager of the Electric Empire put on a special evening of films with all the takings going towards a fund to provide field classes for the Suffolk Regiment, who had many Haverhill men serving in their ranks. Mr Gertine sent special parcels containing a case of cigars and 2 packets of Kitchener's cigarettes to each of his employees who had enlisted. Many letters were received from local men who were POWs or on the front line. They expressed gratitude for the parcels of food, tobacco and clothing which they had received, not only from family members but also from other people and groups in the town. The local newspaper received such a letter, which it published. It read, "I had a parcel sent out to me by Mr C. Boardman, the auctioneer, and I wish to thank the donor. I can tell you the chocolates which he sent were very much appreciated by all out here. We are at present in the trenches, and it's very nice when you can have some light refreshments in these trying times. Accompanied by the heavy roar of the guns and the shells, these light refreshments, as we put it, are always welcome. I am at present where the heavy fire is going on, so you will have guessed where it is. I cannot tell you the name of the place, as we are not allowed to say where we are." David and Chris Hart will now recite some poetry.
Here are just 4 poems from the huge amount of literature that was written by soldiers and others at the front. First we have In Flanders Fields by John McCrae, who was killed very early in the war. then 2 by Wilfred Owen, of whom we're going to hear more later, who was killed towards the end of the war, and then 1 by Siegfried Sassoon, who survived, a friend of Wilfred Owen who survived.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have rumbled on since those gagged days, like traffic checked while at the crossing of city ways. And the haunted gap in your mind has filled with thoughts that flow like clouds in the lit heaven of life. And you're a man reprieved to go, taking your peaceful share of time with joy to spare. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats, the stench of corpses rotting in front of the front-line trench, and dawn coming dirty white and chill with a hopeless rain. Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack, and the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads, those ashen grey masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay? Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget.
It would be less than 4 months before news came of another casualty from the Methodist family. Peter Mead, born in the winter of 1888, was the only child of Charles and Ruth, née Phillips, born nearly 2 years after their wedding on the 25th of December 1886. Both Charles and Ruth were silk weavers who had made 56 Burton End, home for themselves and their baby, when tragedy struck. Ruth died in September 1889 at the young age of 22 years. At the same time, Charles was admitted to an asylum in Woodbridge, where he stayed until his death in 1931. This left baby Peter, at 9 or 10 months old, in the care of his grandfather, David Mead, and his second wife, Matilda, née Mannion, at 13 Burton End. They were both silk weavers, but following David's death in 1901, Matilda became a shirt finisher, working from home. In 1911, Peter was working as a cutter of men's clothes at Chauntry Mill and was still living with his grandmother at 13 Burton End. On the 12th of February 1916, he enlisted in the Cyclist Division of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. Following his training in England, Peter arrived in France on the 4th of January 1917, transferring to the 11th Battalion of the regiment in the field the following month. For the first 5 days of June, the battalion was in trenches in front of Saint-Eloy before being relieved. On the 6th, they moved to the assembly area in readiness for an attack into an old French trench the following day. They were relieved on the 12th, but by the next day they were back in the trenches again and ready for the action which took place on the 14th of June, when they were involved in an attack to the south of Ypres. Peter Mead was killed in action on that day. The South West Suffolk Echo of the 28th of July 1917 reported, "Official news has now been received of the death of Private Peter Mead of the Royal West Kent Cycling Corps. The unofficial announcement of his death some weeks ago was received with the greatest regret by his numerous friends in Haverhill. He was 27 years of age, and when in the town resided with his grandmother, Mrs. Mead, at 13 Burton End. He had been in France for about 6 months, and for many years was employed as a cutter by Messrs. Gertines and Sons. Prior to the outbreak of war, he was a regular member of Haverhill Rovers Football Club and was popular amongst colleagues and spectators alike. His position on the field was centre-half, where he was smart and resourceful and ever a stumbling block to opponents. Peter's name appears on the Menin Gate memorial for the missing at Ypres. At the unveiling of the Haverhill War Memorial, a wreath was laid, inscribed, "In loving memory of Peter Mead, killed in action, June 14th, 1917, his loving Ivy."
We have heard the life stories of 4 men, none of whom have a known grave, all being commemorated on memorials. In September 1914, a man by the name of Fabian Ware, who was too old to be accepted for army duty, arrived in France to command a mobile unit of the British Red Cross. He was quickly struck by the lack of any organisation taking responsibility for the marking and recording of the graves of fallen soldiers and became determined to do something about it. He convinced the War Office that proper care of the war graves would boost the morale of the troops at the front and comfort relatives at home. The work that Fabian Ware started was recognised with the foundation of the Graves Registration Commission in 1915. As early as 1916, Fabian Ware encouraged help from distinguished horticulturalists at Kew and from famous architects of the day about how the cemeteries and memorials should be designated to best commemorate the sacrifice of Commonwealth forces. He campaigned ceaselessly for an official organisation to be set up to do this. On the 21st of May 1917, his diligence was recognised when the Imperial, now Commonwealth, War Graves Commission was established by a royal charter with him as its vice chairman. During the war, Fabian Ware was twice mentioned in dispatches and ended the war as a Major General. In 1920, he became a Knight of 2 Orders in recognition of his tireless work. He explained his motivation, saying, "Common remembrance of the dead is the one thing, sometimes the only thing, that never fails to bring our people together." Sir Fabian returned to the War Office following the outbreak of the Second World War, while continuing his duties for the Commission. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission is responsible for marking and maintaining the graves of those members of the Commonwealth forces who died during the 2 World Wars, for building and maintaining memorials to the dead whose graves are unknown, and for providing records and registers for these 1.7 million burials and commemorations which are found in most countries throughout the world.
Less than 1 month after the death of Peter Mead, news was heard about James Alfred Webb, known as Alf, who was born in Haverhill on the 11th of September 1839, the son of Daniel and Harriet Neathake, both from long-established Haverhill families. Alf's parents were married in November 1881 and set up home at 24 Eden Road, bringing up 5 children there. Daniel had been a labourer, then a brickmaker, before becoming a warehouseman, whilst Harriet had been a sewing machinist making shirts and coats. They moved to Burton End in 1891, where 3 more children were born, including James Alfred. By 1911, the family address was 26 Vine Cottages. Alf's father was employed at D. Gertine and Sons, Chauntry Mill, Haverhill, as a warehouseman and gatekeeper, and Alfred found employment there too as a clothing folder. He enlisted in the army at Chelmsford, and the South West Suffolk Echo reported in September 1914 that he had joined the 9th Battalion Essex Regiment with the rank of Lance Corporal. In March 1915, the battalion went to Aldershot prior to embarking for France, and on the 31st of May, Alf landed at Boulogne. his battalion entering the front line in July 1915 near Pleursterk in Belgium. This was a comparatively quiet sector at this time. Later that year, whilst on leave, he married Daisy Farrant, the daughter of Robert and Sarah Farrant of 12 Mount Road. Her family was also of long-standing in Haverhill, although Daisy, a shirt buttonhole machinist, was born at her mother's parish of Castle Camps. In October 1915, the 9th Battalion was involved in the Battle of Loos, where things were not so quiet. During an attack on the 12th of October, Alf was wounded. He was to be wounded again the following year, 1916, when in action on the Somme. In July 1917, the battalion was just northeast of Monchy-le-Preux, being heavily shelled, and on the 11th of July 1917, Alf, who was now acting company sergeant major, was wounded for a third time. He was taken to number 37 Field Ambulance, but died a few hours later. He was 23 years old. The South West Suffolk Echo of the 28th of July 1917 reported, "Readers will regret that Mrs. J.A. Webb has this week received official information that her husband, Company Sergeant Major Webb of the Essex Regiment, has died as a result of wounds received in action in France." Sergeant Major Webb met his death in the trenches on the morning of July the 11th, a bullet entering his head, and he passed away a few hours later without regaining consciousness. He bore a quiet and unassuming manner, and only a fortnight prior to his death he was home on leave. He had only returned to the trenches for 2 days when he was hit, and about an hour previously he was talking quite cheerfully to Private H.V. Scott of Haverhill of the happy times he had spent in this neighbourhood. He was a very popular NCO and was liked by all with whom he came into contact. Much sympathy would be extended to the young widow and parents. James is buried at the Faubourg d'Amiens Cemetery in Arras, France.
Elias Lloyd was born on the 5th of May 1884, the son of silk weavers William and Rebecca née Darking, who had married in the winter of 1869. He was the second youngest of 6 children, having 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Soon after Elias was born, the family moved to 39 Mill Road, just a short walk to the Methodist chapel that he attended. At the age of 16, he was a domestic servant, working as a house lad, but still living at the family home, which was now just down the road at number 54. By 1911, Elias was boarding at 54 Brookfields, Cambridge, and was working as a railway shunter for the Great Eastern Railway. Obviously, this was not the way of life that Elias wanted, because on the 12th of June 1913, at the age of 28, he boarded the Ascania at Southampton, bound for Quebec. Less than 3 years later, he was heading back to England as part of the Canadian Overseas Expeditionary Force. On his military papers, Elias gave his address as Limerick, a small village in Saskatchewan, which had been established the year he arrived in Canada, so he would have been one of the pioneers who settled there. He was a farmer. His description was given as 5'6", with a ruddy complexion, brown hair and blue eyes. He declared himself to be a Methodist and signed the oath on the 28th of March 1916. Elias joined the 15th Battalion Canadian Machine Gun Corps. After some training, he sailed from Halifax, Nova Scotia on the 3rd of October 1916, arriving in Liverpool 10 days later. Following further training at Crowborough, he sailed to Le Havre on the 8th of February 1917, joining the 15th Battalion Canadian Machine Gun Corps in the field near Vimy Ridge. Having survived the fierce action at Vimy Ridge, Elias and his Canadian Corps moved north to Belgium. On the 6th of November, the Canadians and British launched the assault
to capture the ruined village of Passchendaele itself. On the 11th of November, while just to the west of the village of Passchendaele, Elias was wounded in the right shoulder and admitted to No. 1 Canadian Field Ambulance. Elias was sent to No. 53 General Hospital in Boulogne on the 12th, but by the 21st of November, he was seriously ill. The South West Suffolk Echo of 1st of December 1917 reported, Mrs. Lloyd, formerly resident at 56 Mill Road, Haverhill, has been notified that her second son, Private Elias Lloyd, of a Canadian machine gun company, is seriously ill at No. 53 General Hospital, Boulogne, as a result of a shrapnel wound in the right shoulder. Later, she got the sad news that Elias had died on the 15th of December from a septic wound and bronchopneumonia. Private Elias Lloyd is remembered on his parents' grave in Haverhill and at the Wimmera Communal Cemetery where he was buried. Because of the sandy nature of the soil, the headstones here lie flat upon the graves. In Canada, he is remembered too. The page from the World War I Canadian Book of Remembrance bears Elias Lloyd's name and is displayed in the Memorial Chamber of the Peace Tower in Ottawa on the 18th of June every year. The Methodist Worship Band will now play I Vow to Thee My Country. If you'd like to join in, please do.
vests and socks, gloves, together for the POWs and those at the front. They organised several events to raise money, including a concert in the town hall, proceeds of which were used to buy wool for 10,000 scarves and balaclavas needed for the lads at the front. The local newspaper reported that the concert entertained a nearly full town hall. Top of the bill was the Haverhill String Band. There were many songs, both by individuals and duets, including the vet, Mr. Burgeon, with his comic songs. The stage was decorated with plants and flowers from Mr. D. Gertine, and bright bunting was given by Mrs. Ibbotson. A profit of £15, 17 shillings and 3 pence was made. They received many letters of thanks, such as these.
Thank you very much for the scarf, mittens and socks which you sent to me. I find that they are coming very useful now I'm in the firing line, especially at night time. It is bitterly cold and we feel it a lot as we have to keep in one position all night long.
Thank you very much for sending me the shirt and socks. I also write on behalf of my brother, who is a prisoner in Germany and who has, my mother told me, received various items from you. It's very nice to know that one is remembered and thought of by those at home. The clothing was appreciated by me as we have little time to keep our clothes clean.
Thanks for the parcel received today. The contents are quite correct. I'm sure they will be very useful, especially the socks. As the place we have just come from, we had to change our socks each night, and I think we require them as we were up to our knees in mud and water.
Thank you very much indeed for the parcel which contained a wool vest, one pair of socks and a wool body belt. They will be very handy to me in every way. We begin to have very nice weather out here now, but we have had it rough in the past.
Jessie Pope was an English poet, writer and journalist who remains best known for her patriotic motivational poems published during World War I. Here is her knitting song. Soldier lad on the sodden ground, sailor lad on the seas, can't you hear a little clickety sound stealing across on the breeze? It's the knitting needles singing their song as they twine the khaki or blue. Thousands and thousands and thousands strong, Tommy and Jack for you. Click, 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 how they dart and flick, flashing in the firelight to and fro. Now for pearl and plain, round and round again, knitting love and luck in every row. The busy hands may be rough or white, the fingers gouty or slim. His careful eyes may be youthfully bright, or they may be weary and dim. Lady and work girl, young and old, they've all got one end in view. Knitting warm comforts against the cold, Tommy and Jack for you. Knitting away by the midnight oil, knitting when day begins. Lads, in the stress of your splendid toil, can't you hear the song of the pins? Clickety-click through the wind and the foam, it's telling the boys over there that every woolly that comes from home brings a smile and a hope and a prayer. Click, 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 how they dart and flick, flashing in the firelight to and fro. Now for pearl and plain, round and round again, knitting love and luck in every row.
Victor Fuller Chapman was born in Western Colville, Cambridgeshire, in 1898, one of the 5 children whose parents were James and Martha. His father, James, a native of that village, had been a soldier in the Suffolk Regiment, and in 1891 was stationed at the regimental depot in Bury St Edmunds. In 1891 he married Martha Minns, who came from nearby Hyme, and they settled in Western Colville. At the time of Victor's birth, his father was an under-carpenter on a gentleman's estate. By 1901, the family was living in Great Retting. When Victor's father died in September 1909, aged 41, he was a carpenter of Haverhill and was buried in Haverhill Cemetery. In 1911, Martha was living with Victor and his younger brother and sister, Frederick and Alice, at 2 Crowland Road, Haverhill. And Victor, now 13, was a grocer's errand boy. He was also a regular member of the Methodist Church and the Sunday School. The South West Echo reported on the 15th of March 1915 that Victor of Little Retting had volunteers for his father's old regiment, the 8th Suffolks, although he was later transferred to the 7th Battalion. During the spring offensive of March 1918, Victor's battalion was ordered to protect the river crossings of Albert. On the afternoon of the 26th of March, his company were deployed on the western outskirts of the town. There was little time to dig trenches, but the men took up positions on the railway line and cutting. The Germans advanced through the town from the east in the late afternoon, but were repelled with heavy casualties. However, machine gunners and snipers in nearby houses fired on the Suffolks, inflicting severe losses, and the fighting continued through the night. Victor was hit by a machine gun bullet and died late on the 26th. By the time the battalion was relieved on the 28th, they had suffered 256 casualties, 1 platoon being reduced to just 3 men. Unusually, the war diary names all other ranks, casualties for this action. Those killed and wounded are named for each company, and from this we learn that Victor was in D Company. Victor's company commander wrote to his mother at 2 Little Cottages, Little Ratty. Allow me to convey to you the deepest sympathy of all ranks of this company in the loss of your son, Private V.F. Chapman, who was unfortunately killed on the evening of the 26th. The loss of such a good soldier is indeed great, and I am sure it will be most difficult to replace him. He was a man highly respected by both officers and men, one who could be relied upon to do his duty nobly and well. It will console you to know that he suffered no pain, as he was killed instantly. Of the 72 men recorded being killed 26th and 27th of March 1918, only 9 have identified graves. Since de Rudiger's Roll of Honour specifically records that Victor was buried at Albert, we can only assume that he lies in the grave of one of the many unknown soldiers. Victor is commemorated on the Pozieres Memorial near Albert. We have a moment for reflection now as the Methodist worship band performs Abide With Me.
Lord,
Arthur George Bevis was born in Haverhill at the end of 1881 to George Bevis and his wife Mary Ann née Porter. They were living at Crown Passage, and George was working as a horsekeeper at a brewery. Mary Ann was at home, looking after Arthur and his elder brother Harry and sister Ada Maria. By 1901, Arthur, then aged 20, along with a younger brother Herbert, aged 17, were lodging with their uncle's large family at 11 Bernard Road in Tottenham. They had, no doubt, learnt from their father how to look after horses, as both were working as horsekeepers, Arthur for a tram company. Their parents, George and Mary Ann, were now at 24 Primrose Hill with their sisters Ada and Gertie and younger brothers Sidney and Stanley. Sadly, Arthur's mother died later this same year. Perhaps Arthur's love of horses led him to enlist in Tottenham, joining the 8th Hussars of the line. And on the 4th of January 1902, at this time he was 21 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with blue eyes and fair hair. On the 15th of January 1903, Arthur was posted to the 15th Hussars in India, where he served until 1909, when he was posted to South Africa. He returned home just over 3 years later in January 1913. His service ended when he was discharged on the 23rd of January 1914, and his final reference described him as honest, sober, reliable and hard-working. With the outbreak of war, Arthur re-enlisted at Tottenham, joining the 2nd Battalion, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. In November 1915, the battalion prepared for France, arriving early in 1916. It remained on the Western Front for the remainder of the war, fighting at the battles of the Somme in 1916, along the Hindenburg Line in 1917, and again at the battles of the Somme in 1918. By now, promoted to Sergeant Bevis, he would have been involved in much of the fighting. He did, however, spend a happy few days over Christmas in 1917 when he was able to meet up with his younger brother Stanley, whom he hadn't seen for 15 years. Stanley wrote to his sister saying, "I spent a very happy time this Christmas under the circumstances. I had a visitor to see me. In fact, he rang me up from the next station, and I was with him in a very short time. Who do you think it was but Arthur, my brother, who had just come back from a school of instruction on Christmas Eve. So I went and found him on Christmas Day and brought him up to my place for dinner. In the evening, I had an invitation to the headquarters sergeant's mess, and of course I took him with me, and I can tell you we had a right good time. I've been with him again today, and tomorrow he is coming to have dinner with me." Arthur was killed in action on the 20th of August 1918, and unusually for a non-commissioned man, this was noted in the battalion war diary, which for this date tells us that they were south of Haverhill. By 12 noon, they had suffered 23 other ranks killed and 7 wounded. The diary records, about 1 p.m, the enemy put down a heavy strap on the crucifix posts, which forced B Company to evacuate them for a time. At dusk, all was readjusted. We suffered some casualties owing to the barrage. Second Lieutenant Powell and Sergeant Beavis were killed. Arthur is buried in the Heath Cemetery at Har-Bonnières on the Somme.
Years before him in 1802 was a silk weaver who married local girl Jane Farrant in 1828. Downs Lane was their home, and with their 9 children until Jane died in 1847. It was this Charles Rash who in 1867 paid the first £5 into the funds for the new chapel.
Clement's parents, Walter and Miriam Freeman of Haverhill, were married in 1883, with Walter working as a warehouseman in a clothing factory. They raised 5 children while living at 6 St Boltiff Lane and later 32 Burton End. Their 4th child and young son was Clement Philip Ernest, who was born on the 1st of October 1894.
By 1911, the family had moved to 6 fine cottages, and after leaving school, Clement was apprenticed as a cycle fitter to Mr. Collis Smith, cycle agent at 23 Queen Street, Haverhill. Clem, as he was known to those close to him, was well known and respected member of the community and attended this Methodist church. He met Nellie Hart, our aunt, as they were married in late 1915. Clement enlisted in Luton on the 12th of March 1916 and was placed on reserve.
In October 1916, tragedy struck the family. Nellie gave birth to twins, but one was stillborn and buried on 6th of October. Nellie herself died shortly afterwards and was buried on 11th of October. Just days later, the second twin, a son, Eric, also died, and he was buried on the 21st of October.
Clement was mobilised on the 5th of March 1917, joining the Training Reserve Battalion at Dover. A fortnight later, he was transferred to the 3rd Battalion, the Buffs, and then on the 30th of May, he was transferred once again, this time to the 3rd Battalion, East Surrey Regiment. It was with them that he was posted to France at the beginning of July, but before long he was again transferred, this time to the 2nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment.
In September 1918, Clement took part in the Advance of Victory in Picardy, an artwork between the Somme and Luz. John Court, in a village about 3 miles east of the steep-sided St Quentin Canal, which in places has almost perpendicular cliffs. The banks are lined with brick facing, and with the additional concrete, fortification and machine gun replacements, the canal formed a formidable part of the German Hindenburg Line.
At 4 p.m. on the 1st of October, the 2nd Manchesters, led by Wilfred Owen, were involved in an attack to secure John Court village and advanced as far as a farm known as Swiss Cottage. After fierce hand-to-hand fighting, they forced their way through thick barbed wire, finally clearing the line about 1,400 yards. Clement was killed in action on the 1st of October. This was just days before the 2nd anniversary
of the deaths of his wife and twins.
Clement is remembered on the Vizon Artois Memorial along with more than 9,000 men who fell between the 8th of August and the end of the war and who have no known grave. A wreath was laid at the unveiling of the Town Wall Memorial with the inscription, "In memory of Clem," from his loved ones.
Our Aunt Nellie, our Uncle Clem and our cousins are in a grave in Haverhill Cemetery which carries the inscription, "In loving memory of Private Clement P.E. Rash, killed in France October the 1st, 1918, aged 24 years, with the cross to the crown, and Eric, their infant son, aged 2 weeks. Also of Nellie, his loving wife, died 7th of October, 1816, aged 22 years. At rest."
On November 27, 1918, Clement's father wrote desperately trying to find out where his son had died and where he was buried. He did this for his mother's sake, as he was afraid she would not get over the shock.
War poet, 2nd Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, served with the 2nd Battalion Manchester Regiment alongside Clement Rash. Wilfred Owen was born on the 18th of March 1893 in Oswestry, Shropshire. After school he became a teaching assistant and in 1913 went to France for 2 years to work as a language tutor. He began writing poetry as a teenager. In 1915 he returned to England to enlist in the army and was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment. After spending the remainder of the year training in England, he left for the Western Front early in January 1917. After experiencing heavy fighting, he was diagnosed with shell shock. Evacuated to England, he arrived at a hospital near Edinburgh in June. There he met the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who read Wilfred's poems and gave him encouragement. Although he may have stayed on home duty indefinitely, he returned to active service in France in July 1918. On the 1st of October 1918, the day when Clement Rash was killed in action, Owen led units of the 2nd Manchesters, including Clement, as they stormed a number of enemy strong points near the village of Johncourt. For his courage and leadership in this action, Wilfred Owen was awarded the Military Cross. On the 4th of November 1918, just a week before the end of the war, 2nd Lieutenant Wilfred Owen was killed while attempting to lead his men across the canal at Oars. The news of his death reached his parents on the 11th of November, Armistice Day. St Mary's Singers will now perform for us.
The Armistice Day from the War Requiem by Benjamin Britten. We have heard about Wilfred Owen, the war poet. Benjamin Britten chose 9 pieces of his poetry alongside pieces from the Requiem Mass for the War Requiem. Wilfred Owen's poems describe the horrors of trench war, and he pulls no punches in indicting the church and the state for their complicity in warmongering. The words in this piece of music, the Agnus Dei, alongside the Latin words, evoke the image of the lonely Christ denied by his disciples, hanging where the shell roads apart. The poem includes bitter indictment of those who walk past Golgotha, but reflects the greater love of Christ and a love that man gives when he gives his life for the freedom of all.
Oh,
On the 8th of August 1918, the Allied counter-offensive broke the German line at Amiens, and large numbers of Germans surrendered as their army retreated. Facing political collapse in Germany and hoping to avoid an Allied invasion, the Germans chose peace. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France, at 5 p.m. on Monday, November the 11th, 1918. 6 hours later, at 11 a.m., all hostilities ceased. The eagerly awaited and welcome news that an armistice had been signed for Germany was rumoured in Haverhill during the morning. But it was not until the arrival of the evening newspapers that it was known for certain. The general inquiry was, is it true? When the truth had finally been realised, flags of all kinds were unfurled and flown from public businesses and residences. At 8:30, the band commenced to march around the streets. It was reported in the local paper that some people began to dance in the streets, but the mood was apparently quite orderly and the police found nothing at all to do with. Thanksgivings were quickly arranged by all the churches in the town, and straight away lighting orders were relaxed. People in Haverhill celebrated the end of the war into the new year, a war that had lasted 4 years and 4 months.
You might have thought that with the armistice in 1918 there would be no more casualties, but in 1919 the last of the men named on this memorial died. He was John Jobson. John's parents, Thomas Jobson and Emma Mays, married in 1859. At first, they settled at Burton End. After the birth of their first 2 children, they moved to what was described as a private house at Little Ratting, where a further 7 children were born. John, who was born in 1877, was the 3rd youngest of their 9 children. By 1891, the family had moved back to Haverhill and were living at 60 Primrose Hill. At this time, his sisters and eldest brother were employed as factory hands, presumably at Chauntry Mill. John too was to find employment at Chauntry Mill, for he worked as a fibre mat weaver. In 1899, he married Mary Ann Clark. Mary Ann was the daughter of farm bailiff John Clark and his wife Mary Ann Nee Sorrell, who were originally from Helens Bumpstead. As a child, she lived in a house on Chalkston Hills, Little Ratting, not far from where John grew up. John and Mary Ann made 13 Burton End a home for their growing family. By 1911, they had moved to 36 Withersfield Road with their 5 daughters. At this time, Mary Ann was working from home, tailoring coats for the gents' clothing manufactory at Chauntry Mill. 2 more daughters, born before 1916, made the family complete. One can only imagine what it must have been like for John living at home with so many females. John and Mary Ann made 1 more house move, setting up home in Vine Cottages, where they were neighbours of his brother Lewis. On enlistment, John joined the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, but was later transferred to the Labour Corps. At 40, he would be one of the older men to join up. On the 17th of April 1919, a few days before he was due to be demobilised, he was working at the station yard in Pampersford when he was involved in an accident. He died at the 1st Eastern General Hospital later in the day. from a serious injury he had sustained. He was 42 years old. An inquest was held and it was reported that John had died as a result of being run over by an army lorry. A report of the inquest was published in the Cambridge Independent Press on the 25th of April 1919. It stated that Private Norris had told the court that about 10 a.m. on the 17th of April, he and John were working with a lorry. John had uncoupled the loaded trailer, and while Private Norris turned the lorry around to pick up an empty trailer, John walked across the yard and tried to jump on the step of the slow-moving lorry. The witness said the motor was going slowly when John got hold of the side and put his left foot onto the step. His foot slipped off the step and he fell just in front of the wheel, which passed right over him. John managed to roll out from under the lorry without any assistance. Colonel Frederick Dayton told the inquest that John was admitted to hospital but was in a collapsed state and only partially conscious. He died during the afternoon. Death was due to shock and internal hemorrhage. His chest and abdomen were badly bruised and his limbs were crushed. Lieutenant May said he wished to express, on behalf of himself and the comrades of the deceased, their deep regret at the accident and their sincere sympathy with the relatives. He had known John for 2 or 3 years. He was always a very honest and industrious worker and one of the best men they had. The Deputy Coroner said that the sad affair was entirely an accident without blame to anyone and entered a verdict accordingly. John was buried in Haverhill Cemetery.
I would like to pose the question, why 2 minutes? On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the guns of Europe fell silent. After 4 years of bitter fighting, the Great War was finally over. The first Remembrance Day was conducted in 1919 throughout Britain and the Commonwealth. Originally called Armistice Day, it commemorated the end of hostilities the previous year. It came to symbolise the end of the war and provide an opportunity to remember those who had died. On May the 8th, 1919, an Australian journalist, Edward George Honey, had a letter published in the London Evening News. He proposed a respectful silence of 5 minutes to remember those who had given their lives in the First World War. The letter was seen by King George V, who approved of the idea but shortened it to 2 minutes. On the 7th of November 1919, a declaration was made to the country and carried in the press. To all my people, Tuesday next, November the 11th, is the first anniversary of the armistice, which stayed the worldwide carnage of the 4 preceding years and marked the victory of right and freedom. I believe that my people in every part of the empire fervently wish to perpetuate the memory of that great deliverance and of those who laid down their lives to achieve it. To afford an opportunity for the universal expression of this feeling, It is my desire and hope that at the hour when the armistice came into force, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, there may be, for the brief space of 2 minutes, a complete suspension of all our normal activities. During that time, except in the rare cases where this may not be impracticable, all work, all sound, and all locomotion should cease, so that in perfect stillness the thoughts of everyone may be concentrated on reverent remembrance of the glorious dead. The Manchester Guardian reported how that first Armistice Day tribute was received by the public. The first stroke of 11 produced a magical effect. The tram cars glided into stillness. Motors ceased to cough and fume and stopped dead. And the mighty limbed dray horses hunched back upon their loads and stopped also, seeming to do it of their own volition. Someone took off his hat, and with a nervous hesitancy, the rest of the men bowed their heads also. Here and there, an old soldier could be detected slipping unconsciously into the position of attention. An elderly woman not far away wiped her eyes, and the man beside her looked white and stern. Everyone stood very still. The hush deepened. It had spread over the whole city and become so pronounced as to impress one with a sense of audibility. It was a silence which was almost pain, and the spirit of memory brooded over it all. At the end of the Second World War, in 1945, Armistice Day became Remembrance Day to include all those who had fallen in the 2 world wars and other conflicts.
The widow of a Haverhill man who had been killed in action received a letter from a soldier in the trenches. It contained a short poem, and I'd like to read it now. The midnight stars are shining upon his lonely grave. The one we miss is sleeping, the one we tried to save. He gave his life for king and country. It was a sacrifice of love. We must all prepare to meet him in our Father's home above. And now a single verse from a poem written by Robert Lawrence Freeman in September 1914 called For the Fall. You will all be very familiar with these words. It is used by the Royal British Legion at remembrance services. This will be followed by the last post, after which we will observe a 1-minute silence. Please stand, would you? They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them. gave out today.
Please take it. We've come to the end of our evening of remembrance, and I'd like to thank all the readers and of course all our performers for their contributions, and to all our guests. I thank you all for coming to join us this evening. Perhaps now would be a good time to show appreciation to everyone who has made this evening so special.